Life, Love, and Lipstick.
Welcome to Life, Love, and Lipstick with Lesley Stewart and myself, Tracy Lynn. And today, I'm excited about this one. It's going to be a great show because it's a hot topic. No matter if you call it the quarantine D, if you're recently going through a divorce or you're thinking about a divorce, or you have been going through one for a long time. We do get a little bit personal on the show. We have been very open to that. Both myself and Lesley have gone through a divorce.
Going through it.
I've been through it. I've signed, sealed, delivered it, done, stamped, everything. You are going through the divorce. Going on almost 8 years. And we talk about the difference in things. And now I made a comment and I said, well, maybe I should reopen mine. I feel like I would like to redo my divorce. But when I say that, it's because I was very angry. And a lot of females, I think, would agree, if depending on which end you are on it, you're angry. You just want to get it done. You want to get it dealt with. And, you just sign off. And then you realize afterwards that you may have been entitled to a little bit more than you thought. So it's a mental game, right, Lesley? When you
I think along the way, a lot of females have told me, don't give up, keep going. I gave up, or I didn't fight at all. And so I've had a lot of encouragement over the years for people to say, like, stick with it. And because it's, and all I've ever wanted is fair. Some people want all of it. I just want fair. And sometimes fair is not that easy. So we've decided to bring on an actual lawyer today. It's somebody that can really give us some solid information. Robert Halpern from Halpern Law Group. Thank you so much for coming on the show with us, because we're just going to inundate you with all kinds of interesting questions that will hopefully help our viewers and listeners kind of navigate their way through this.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes. Welcome to Life, Love, and Lipstick. I'm sure probably a different platform than what you're used to being on. So we have a mixed bunch of people that watch this show, and for different reasons. And one of them being is because we like to keep things very real. And we've talked about divorce. We talk about the stress of the divorce. But there's, to me, two types of people. Robert, would you agree that there's the ones, and I'm sure there's pros and cons to either one of them, the ones that say, oh, we're just going to separate. I don't need that divorce. We'll be fine. And then there's the one that's, I'm getting that divorce. And no matter how long it takes, they go through with it. Is there any pros or benefits to just separating and not getting a divorce?
Well, I think by divorce, you're referring to the overall financial settlement, as opposed to the status of no longer being married, which the latter is, of course, required for remarriage. But if you're talking about people who just want out and who don't want to pursue all of their financial rights, there is a wide variety on the spectrum, where you've got people who look at things holistically, and money is just one part of what they're trying to attain. Some of them just want peace, some just want finality, some are preoccupied with the children, and many are victims of small a abuse and are caught up in a dynamic where they can't separate their needs from what their husband or wife would tell them they're entitled to. There are many variables involved in determining who is going to pursue what. You can't really isolate it into two groups, because of course there are just so many things that one hopes to achieve in the process. But that sense of fairness that you're talking about, regrettably, there's different perceptions of the word fair. And where you consider, I always say to new clients, you will each have your own honest, subjective belief about what you're entitled to. And it's hard to disabuse your spouse of their perception of fairness, because you're talking about something that's almost an objective standard, which really, it doesn't exist until you go to court. And a lot of people are shocked by their spouses on departure, which in some ways surprises me, because they're behaving in a way typically which characterize the reasons for the breakdown. So it shouldn't be that surprising. But whether you've been left or you leave, it's still painful because there's a sense of loss owing to dashed expectations. So the bottom line is people respond differently, Tracy, in response to what you said. And I've seen it all from the most passive to the most aggressive. And there's no rhyme or reason.
Well, interesting that you mentioned that, Robert. So you're saying, moving from, being in that relationship and maybe the reason why you're leaving that relationship. I know I chose collaborative law first and stuck with it for about 2.5 years and didn't get anywhere with it. I'd love to know your opinion on that, because does it work for some? It must work for some people, but both parties must be completely compliant. Like, I've assumed that I could finish my divorce very easily in collaborative law, but I would have to have trust my partner. And that's the reason why we are separating. So to your point.
Well, Lesley, you raised a good point from my perspective on collaborative law. I'll just tell you briefly that there are basically 6 ways you can resolve your case. There's direct negotiation at one extreme. There's litigation at another. There are 3 forms of alternative dispute resolution, and I'm happy to touch on them, including mediation, arbitration, or something called mediar. And then there's collaborative law. The premise of collaborative law is exactly what you've said. It implies that both parties are committed to peaceful resolution, where there's an openness in terms of financial disclosure and not being as positional. But the problem with it, from my perspective, is there's a limitation on what you can do with the evidence that you acquire in the collaborative law process. The fact that you sign an agreement that prevents your collaborative law lawyer from acting for you in litigation. It's the perfect scenario for 2 people who are in the same place emotionally and have the same perception of, going back to what Tracy said, fairness, with a view to having the same end game of resolution, amicable, expeditious, cost-effective. But the problem is, and I don't know if you experienced this, Lesley, when people are in a different place on the emotional curve, or they've got a different agenda, it's very hard to bring about a resolution through the collaborative law process. And this is the sad reality, and you get stuck in it. I know there's some big fans of it, and it's a special case where it's going to succeed.
Well, I just found during the process is that time just gets wasted. And so you plan for everybody to get together, a 4-way meeting, and then all of a sudden one person cancels, which was, often can be the ex. And the next thing you know, the meeting's scheduled for another 2-3 months away. And all of a sudden a year's passed and another year's passed and you haven't gotten anywhere. And as you say, if you don't get full financial disclosure, you can't go anywhere with it. I just got it like a month ago after all these years.
Yeah, and that all the cases say the same thing that go to court. Like it shouldn't even be something you have to go to court for. It should be a presumption that there'll be full financial disclosure. So there's a level playing field. So you know what your rights and obligations are and what your exposure is. And likewise, the other side, so you can amicably, expeditiously, cost effectively, hopefully negotiate a deal. Otherwise, you have an uneven playing field. So not to be, I don't know anything about your matter, Lesley, but collaborative law may or may not have been the right forum for you based when there's resistance to providing full disclosure early on.
Right.
So I'm sorry you went through that.
Thank you. I know now, I mean, obviously hindsight, right? You look back and so that's why I thought it's a great conversation to bring up, because it seems like a nice neutral place to be. It doesn't feel as scary to go into collaborative law. But if you're not going to get anywhere, I love women and men to know that if you know you're on opposite ends of the spectrum, don't even bother, because it just wastes your time. So
yeah, you've got to know with whom you're dealing, and there's 4 people involved, 2 lawyers and 2 parties, and all it takes is for one of them to not be on the same page, either tactically, emotionally, whatever their agenda may be, conscious or subconscious, for an agreement not to be had early on. So it's a delicate process. I find the most effective thing is either commencing a court action, threatening to commence a court action while negotiating in order to keep everybody honest from the perspective of knowing consequences if they're not going to embark on a process that you had wanted, Lesley, which is one of fairness and full disclosure.
That's right.
That's the regrettable part, because despite the intimacy that you two, by you two, I mean listeners, shared with their partner, the reality is that you're now adverse to one another. You may have the same objective in terms of wanting things to be resolved quickly and nicely, but there's still that emotional undercurrent and unresolved issues. It's not like commercial litigation or slip and fall where all the events have occurred. There's a high level of emotionality. So it's not surprising that you can take that high level of emotionality, hope to get it resolved in collaborative law, but because of residual feelings, unresolved matters, it can't happen. Mm-hmm. Now, for some, it's highly successful. For the cases which involve little by way of assets, typically, where it's very cut and dried, where people are both encouraged, guided by a desire to resolve things quickly and cheaply, and they don't want to fight genuinely, it's the right process. But you don't need much to upset the apple cart in terms of creating a disparity in position and a failure in that process.
Yeah.
There are problems with every process I described.
There's a lot of emotions that come into play because it's not an easy decision. Sometimes there's been a lot of stuff that's added up and you're at your breaking point, a lot of emotions. Now, if somebody is out and they want to retain a lawyer because they've decided yes, and they know that mediation will not work. I know for myself, I tried it, but I was a very angry person. I wasn't willing to listen, or I just wasn't I just was like, fine, that's it. It's done. It's over. Let's get it over with. Like, that's just my personality. But when it comes to retaining a lawyer, and obviously our emotions are all over the place. Sometimes we can't focus very well. We're a little bit anxious. What should we do on our end? What questions and information should we do on our end to make it an easier walk through the door in your office?
Well, that's a very good question, because a lot of clients don't focus on what they can do to help it themselves in the matter. So at a first meeting, what I do, and I'll get to your answers, I go through the background facts, I discuss the law in general, I discuss the law as it relates to the particular facts at issue, and then I map out a strategy. To that end, I ask clients to prepare a narrative in advance of meeting with me, and I cover a variety of headings based on the relief that I know they'll be looking for, from kids to property to support. And I conclude by asking them what their objective is, because that is a very important feature in terms of what we discussed earlier. Do they want to string it out to get every last dollar? Do they want out early within the general range of fairness so they can move on to parenting and perhaps a new partner? So that's from the lawyer's perspective. But when choosing a lawyer, the prospective client should speak to friends about who's recommended. Word of mouth is critical. Find somebody who will try and champion you. It's a visceral response. When you meet them or you speak to them briefly, it's almost like dating, you may know. And ask yourself, what do you want the process to look like in terms of reaching your objective? And is this the right horse for the race? Is this person going to bring you there? But in terms of who to call, where to go, of course, you can look online. There's the Law Society Referral Service, which has a list of lawyers. There's the Lexpert. It's called L'(expert) list of leading practitioners in the field in your geographical area. There are a variety of sources. If it's a legal aid case, there's a roster of lawyers there. But I would start with word of mouth through a friend who's been successful, or somebody that you're friendly with or related to, whose word you respect, and see if there's a match. And any lawyer worth their salt won't have any difficulty being asked questions as part of what we sometimes refer to in the industry as a beauty contest to determine of the candidates are they a good fit?
Right.
So, because it's a critical relationship. And
It
the
is.
important thing is, if your spouse has already retained somebody, very important to ask the prospective lawyer about their relationship with that lawyer,
Right.
the other spouse's lawyer, because that's a big factor in determining how quickly matters can be resolved.
Okay. During this process, is there a point where there's no return, where maybe they go through this and then at one point they decide, you know what, maybe we don't want to get divorced? Can that happen, or is it once it starts and the process has started? I mean, I've never had that, but I'm just wondering, like, you mean, you hear stories where sometimes they decide they want to be together after it.
Well,
Can you just stop it?
you can stop it at any time.
Mhm.
Even after the divorce is granted, you can reconcile if you want. But I've had people who have split on the honeymoon. I've had people who split after 60 years of marriage. And and that's just the duration of the relationship. But
Yeah.
I've had people who've had a first meeting with me, and I don't take it personally, but on meeting with me and experiencing that surreal interview where they're determining their rights and obligations versus the process that they have to undergo to go through it. They go, you know what? I'm going to stay. And there are people who start it who get back together because they realize that they don't want to do it, really sometimes on the brink of trial. So it can happen at any time, and sometimes it's the jolt that the relationship needs. I ask every new client, this doesn't really answer your question, but I think it might generate some discussion. What's the worst thing your spouse can say about you, which is true? And often I have prospective clients go, oh, she'll say I'm a da-da-da. And I always say, which is true. And they go, oh, which is true. Because they know what the complaints are going to be.
Right.
I always ask them in that first meeting, which is true, because I want to know what I'm going to be confronting. And because the relationship with my client is really important, and there's got to be a foundation of honesty. So I want to know the worst.
Right.
One guy said to me, oh, she'll say I'm a murderer and a thief. I said, no, which is true. And they said, well, technically, when we stopped off at that 7-Eleven and my buddy pulled out the gun and then I was driving the getaway car, I was charged with that constructive murder doctrine. And so I guess I am a murderer and a thief. But normally I get every form of addiction, deviation that you can imagine.
That's a good question, though, because as you say, eventually things can get so dirty that it can get thrown back at you. And so it's nice to know when you're in kind of a squeaky clean position and the other person isn't. Right?
I know. So I've had some people say there's nothing that they could say about me which is negative, which is true. And I go through, what about this? I go through my various addictions and fetishes that people present with. I go, no. But then I come up on the final item, which is the catch-all, and I say, you nag. They always go, yes, that I do. If they don't do any of the really word. If they don't do any of the bad things, there's nagging because there's been no outlet for any of their anger. Anybody can nag.
Sure.
I don't like that word, though. It kind of seems like the go-to word that men use.
Oh no, I've heard it from men and women.
Yeah.
Yeah, but mostly men say it about women, though.
Yeah, no, see, it went the other way in mine. He was a nagger. Well, disclosure. So how can we, let's look at, so we've looked at collaborative law a little bit, and then, the mediation side of things with, obviously there's somebody assisting to help get through the process with the lawyers. Maybe you can explain that. And then how do people prevent going to court? Is there a way? I heard it's only a small percentage of people that actually end up in court, but I guess it's just where they're banging heads and there's just no way of resolving with a mediator.
So just to quickly go through the various forms, there's negotiation, which is between the lawyers or the parties directly. Again, full financial disclosure required for everything I'm going to tell you. It's necessary if you want your agreement to stand up.
Mhm.
So that's at one end where you can resolve it on your own or with lawyers directly. Or at the other end, you have to go before a judge in litigation. But these forms of alternative dispute resolution include mediation, where you go to a third party who can make recommendations as to how the matter can be resolved, with full financial disclosure. And if the parties come to an agreement, the agreement is binding, but the recommendations of the mediator aren't binding. They're just recommendations. There's also arbitration, which involves a third party that you pay privately who can make determinations like a judge. They make awards, which are held up by the court, usually in almost every instance. And the advantage of arbitration is you don't, it's not public. It's a private process, and you don't have to go to court. You deal with it more discreetly, but you have to pay for it. And then there's something called medi-arb, where the mediator puts on their mediator's cap, tries to resolve it by, to use your expression, banging heads. And if they can't resolve it, they take off their mediator's cap and put on their arbitrator's cap, and down the road, make a determination. So to answer your question, the only thing that is involuntary that you can impose upon another person is court. All the alternative dispute resolution mechanisms are voluntary. You got to sign up for it, as is negotiation. So if somebody's immovable, court is the only answer. Nobody's obliged to be reasonable as to process. That said, if somebody isn't reasonable and it goes to trial, they could be looking at costs being awarded against them, and the court will want to know who's made what efforts to try and resolve things, who's been reasonable. But they only ask for that after they determine the matter on the merits and deal with costs. So there are great extremes, Tracy, in terms of process, but in terms of voluntariness, only the mediation, the arbitration, the medi-arb, and negotiation is voluntary.
I see.
If you've got somebody who's entrenched, you must go to court.
Okay. I'm sure you've dealt with multiple personalities when you're dealing with divorces and everything that has to do with family and dividing up assets and custody and everything that money. What happens when your client is the difficult one?
Well, you write very firm opinion letters in respect of what their options are and what you recommend and the consequences if they don't follow it. And we're talking more in that case of people who insist on a certain result, even though you think it's contrary to their best interest. You have a duty to inform them as to their options and their rights and obligations and their risk. Like most things in life, it's a risk assessment for them. Or, as we discussed earlier, they may value things other than financial, but like they put a premium on it, but as you as a lawyer, you feel obliged to tell them what the financial consequences are because that's your job.
Yeah.
Sure, you can talk about the need for finality, the desirability of it, but first and foremost, your object is to get them as counsel the best result possible. If things are really extreme, you have a duty to be partisan to your client, but if there's what's called a loss of confidence going to the root of the relationship, you're allowed to discharge them and they you in certain circumstances. You can't do it on the day before a trial, but if there's clearly it's just not working.
Yeah.
And that could include constantly suggesting a course of action and the lawyer and the client refusing. Fundamentally, though, it's the client's duty to instruct, and it's the lawyer's duty to advise. But sometimes in the exercise of your duties, there's a disparity in terms of having a cohesive relationship. So and gulfs develop, a loss of confidence.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I know that happened in my situation. From my ex's perspective, where one of his lawyers along the way just decided to withdraw from him. And so that held up the timeline again, right? Like there's all kinds of situations that can happen along the way that can slow down the process. And that was one of them again, where we were supposed to be, meeting and hopefully, resolve, at least get to some point of resolve. And, and then all of a sudden, oh no, we need to find a new lawyer. That lawyer needs to be, well-versed on. And so situations like that, they don't help the process either.
Lesley, I really appreciate your talking about your own experience, because it really underscores if you're in the wrong process, or people have different attitudes towards financial disclosure or gamesmanship, or what they value in general. Very important. You need the right lawyer and the right process.
You do. And because it really can take years off your life. It's like chronic stress, right? It sits with you always. And, again, hindsight, you look back and you'd love to make different choices. But at the time as Tracy had mentioned before, your frame of mind, your state of mind, I'm sure firsthand, Robert, when people come into you, the first time they come to you, they're often very emotional. I remember being very emotional. So I was kind of looking for somebody that was soft and had a nice way about them, so that I had this wonderful, female lawyer, and we were just kind of chummy, and it was nice. But again, that was collaborative law that didn't work for me. But I didn't want to go to some big scary lawyer that freaked me out. But you got to find something in the middle, as you say, that relationship that works for you, that connection.
I think it's critical that they're soft with you, but hard with the other side.
Yes.
And by hard with the other side, I don't mean pathologically bent on running up your costs.
Right.
They've got their own agenda, like many lawyers who are playing out why they're lawyers. But it's a fine mix, and you've got to have a high level of comfort. And like I said, feel that they can champion you in the right context. So Tracy walks in, that she's heated, she's upset, and she wants out.
Yeah.
And so that's a client type to address, and the more passive as well. So as counsel, you've got to take your client as you find them and gently shepherd them through the process, redirect. In Tracy's case, if I may use you, Tracy, question of saying, okay, here's what you're entitled to. Before you are willing to walk, this is what you should know you're leaving on the table. And this is what it will cost you. And Tracy may say, I'm fine with that, because I've got other priorities, which is her right too. The key is to know, and if she wants to pursue that her rights to the fullest, it's available to her. So you two are great, because you're so forthcoming, and you're also, you display different aspects of dealing with the issue differently, and it's not a question of being right or wrong.
And we want to teach women. We want to show them that, like, these are your options, and you know what? It's okay to be angry, but don't be stupid. For anyone, male or female, not just saying it's just, females, but, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but sometimes you have to wipe the tears away in the anger and take the emotion out of it, because it comes down to fair. Now that is leading into my next question. Prenups are very popular. More so now. They're not so like, ooh, did you say a prenup? And people used to just like lose their rocker when they would hear someone bring that up. But now, would you say that they're more popular now in this day and age, with so many people going through a divorce and most relationships not working out, versus maybe it's more popular the second time around when you get married again, if you choose to?
Yeah, it certainly is more popular the second time around, as you say. There's less of a stigma. Part of it is because everybody understands the need to try and protect your estate for your children. That's a main motivator, and usually they're older children on both sides. Not always, of course, but the average separation is after 13 to 15 years of marriage. And you'll have children by then, typically, and you're anxious to protect for the children, and both parties will have gone through it and know the frustration, and are in a place where they can treat it more like a commercial transaction. And so, and as you say, there's less of a stigma about it. So it certainly happens more frequently with second marriages, as opposed to two people starting out often with nothing. and they want to build together. And it's certainly very, very common in scenarios where you have one person from a family of haves, and they're marrying somebody with a have who's a have-not, and they want to protect. And that's a very common area for domestic contracts, be they cohabitation agreements or marriage contracts, to protect wealth for the next generation.
I can imagine too, when there's businesses involved too, right? It gets more complicated, which is part of mine as well. There's a family business involved. So that adds to the complexity, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
As there could be other shareholders. A spouse could have an interest in the business, and that their siblings have an interest as well. And nobody wants their siblings' separation to impact. So there are things like shareholder agreements, adoption agreements that are done as a matter of planning before their separation by corporate and family law lawyers working together, depending on the size of the business, to ensure that in the event of breakdown, there's not a right of enforcement against corporate assets, or maybe there's a valuation model for dealing with shares, how shares are valued. So there isn't a lot of, so it's a quicker process in terms of resolution. So yeah, I think, Tracy, they are more common. I actually do a form of marriage contract mediation. And what that is rather than in the separation scenario that I discussed, is prior to getting married, where parties want to enter into a marriage contract, it's not unusual for you have one going to lawyer A, the other going to lawyer B because they need independent legal advice. And you've got, in the context of thinking about the terms of a contract, you've got one lawyer saying you're giving too much, the other one saying you're accepting too little, and it creates a certain polarity between the parties before they've even got married. So I do a form of mediation in advance, and I stipulate in my mediation contract that the lawyers are not allowed to communicate with each other. They can only communicate with me, so I can take whatever the issue is and mediate it with the parties directly. So that's
smart.
That's avoiding conflict in a scenario where you've got two people who are happy or just trying to come together.
Right.
Not a separation scenario.
Right. Right.
What's your view on marriage? I want to talk about you, Robert. And I mean, you deal with some pretty heavy stuff all day long, every day, when it comes to the good, the bad, mostly the bad of the marriage process of breakdown. What's your view on marriages, especially in today's world? Are we still saying, yes, go get married, no matter if it's your second, third, first? Or are you more of a, hey, just let things be, we don't need to get married? Because I mean, you still kind of deal with the same thing at the end of the day if you're common law.
Well, the law is different if you're common law versus married, and I'd be happy to explain, but I don't know if that is sufficient time for that. But in terms of the institution itself, I'm very much pro, and it's forget about the legal. It speaks to a deeper connection, but it's down to two people. There are different ways they can express that commitment, as long as they both have the same perception. But I don't have a jaundiced view. If that's what you're asking, I
thought maybe you were jaded by seeing all these divorces all the time and how nasty people can get.
No, the reality is that I recognize that it's situational. It's who they are in the moment. I don't think it defines them. Sure, there are elements of them, but it's a crisis, and it's loss, and it's, as I say, situational. And I recognize that. And when I had this man come in, and he was absolutely detached and treated it absolutely. He had just separated as a commercial transaction in every sense. I'm not talking about a few months later. I'm talking about the next day. And he was more concerning for me because he didn't have the emotionality. I expect people to be upset, but that's part of my job. Get them through it. Get them to the other side. It's a life event. And I don't mean to be glib about it, but after years of doing it, you do expect upset and a range of behavior and response that is just very common
Mhm.
across the board. So you get used to it. And yes, Tracy, I believe in love.
Good. I wanted to hear that. That's so exciting. I love it. You said something that triggered another question. What are the common or a common mistake, just even if you give me one, that people make when it comes to getting a divorce?
Um,
I love that you still love.
yes, that of course it's understandable to personalize it, but
Mhm.
sometimes the other person leaves for a variety of reasons unrelated to the left spouse, and they have to find their own way out and rediscover who they are. And it's, of course, it's naive to say, well, they just have to detach and, and just treat it as just yet another hurdle. It's devastating, especially when they see the impact on children. But if there's any advice, it's to become self-aware, accept the fact that it's painful and that it's a process, and they have to get through it like many other losses, and be gentle with themselves from the perspective of understanding that how they're feeling is common, and dejection and you've got a lot of anger on the part of people who lead that,
Yeah.
as I said before, dashed expectations, and a feeling that the other person has really let them down. At least that's their perspective. And as we know, we family law practitioners know that there's his, hers, and then the truth lying somewhere in the middle, because it's never all one way.
Three sides to every story, isn't there?
Yeah.
Well, just before we go, I just want to jump a little bit to the children's side of things. As you mentioned, how it impacts the kids. I think a lot of people hesitate on leaving because of the children and because of the, it is quite traumatic for children, regardless of how old or young they are. It's hard to see your parents split. But I know a lot of people ask me, because I have a 12-year-old son, a lot of people ask me, when does the child have a voice where they can speak up and say which parent they would like to be with? That I've heard that it flexes, but maybe I think that's a question that a lot of people have out there. They want to know, particularly if one parent is the dominant parent and maybe the child isn't safe or doesn't want to go to the other parent.
Well, there's no definitive age. The cases are all over the place in terms of when the court will put a lot of weight on what a child has to say. The child's views and preferences, where they can be ascertained, is the wording. But you've got highly mature 12-year-olds and highly immature 15-year-olds, and it's a question of context. There's something called the Voice of the Child report, which is short of a full assessment, where a child can speak to a mental health practitioner, and the mental health practitioner will try and ascertain their views and preferences and determine whether they're giving that position on a voluntary basis. There's a very interesting dynamic often where you have parents accusing the other of alienating the children, but you also have estrangement, where parents, through bad parenting, create a gulf between them and their child. But these are, in some cases, are a combination of the two, because a parent feels alienated, so they're acting in a way which estranges the child from them. It's a very delicate dynamic, but so it's age specific is the short answer. Each case depends on their own facts. I've just told you what the basic principle is, but if a child is of a certain age, 13, 14, 15, and expresses a strong view, then it may be worthwhile to speak to your lawyer about whether it's an appropriate case to move for a Voice of the Child report, or at the more extreme, a full-blown what's called Section 30 custody and access assessment, where the child's best interest is being addressed, and the professional, typically a psychologist or social worker, will speak to a bunch of collaterals, like teachers, doctors, neighbors, relatives, to get a sense of who's been the more appropriate parent, and then make recommendations. So again, there's a wide range of
Mhm.
responses to try and get to the bottom of what's in the child's best interest. But one thing for sure is that all the research shows that if you want a predictor of a child growing up dysfunctional, make sure you have a high conflict situation
Right.
where there's a tremendous amount of loyalty conflict, and the
Mhm.
child is just,
Yeah.
that's a recipe for disaster for sure.
That's the worst. Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And you definitely do hear a lot of people say, oh no, we're staying together for the kids. Because they think, well, I don't want to pay for the divorce. I don't want to have to go through that. They don't want to, but then they'll separate, but then that's it, right? They always have
or they live this horrible life and set a bad example.
separate lives under one roof.
Right.
Toxic life that the kids are exposed to versus separating and having maybe two strong parents separated in two different homes.
So another thing I ask a new client when they are going down a certain path, I ask them whether they love their children more than they dislike their wife or husband.
Yes.
Oof.
It's a good one.
Try
Yeah.
and bring it down. Let's get real.
Yeah.
What's our objective here?
Yes.
And why pursue that avenue? It may be hurtful, but to the other spouse, but what's the impact on the child?
Or do you love your child more than you love your money? Because that's another one.
It's another one.
Right? Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Wow. We could keep this going, but all I'm
No.
going to say is that I just love that you are loving everything and you have not been jaded, Robert, with all this divorce. And I know the media too can make divorce look extremely nasty, which it doesn't have to be. And I'm sure that there are some cases where it's just like easy, cut the cake, serve it, it's
Yep.
done and over with. And it's done in an amicable way and nobody is hurt, right?
But
So
the media, you might read about those sensationalized cases, but
Yeah.
those are the ones that grab attention. But yes, most cases are, I wouldn't say cut and dried because I don't want to reduce people's lives to that sort of expression, but they're not particularly difficult legally, and they're capable of resolution. They're not headline grabbers, and they don't really grab the fancy of the public. But 97% of cases, I believe the statistic is, once a court action has been commenced, settle. Only 3% go to trial, ignoring those alternative dispute resolution processes or the like, because the cost is prohibitive. And unless you're pathologically bent on trying to hurt the other person, which, by the way, you're not going to find solace in a judge's decision. One thinks that they may, but
yeah, people think that, absolutely think that. Right?
That's television, where it goes all one way.
Right. Right. It doesn't work that way anymore. And the sad part is you see before, back in the day where it was like women would think it was always in their favor, right? And I'm going to go take him out. And then, the guy's living in the back of it in his truck and and she's got the mansion. Like, it doesn't work that way. You can't just go and take all of his money or all of his assets, right? That's the reason why there's full disclosure and you work it through.
And we didn't touch on them today, but there's a formula for dealing for property. There are ranges as it relates to child support and spousal support. It's what's called substantive law, where you're dealing with what a court would do with property and support. Today, we talked more about process.
Yes.
That's a whole other topic.
We'll have you on again. We will.
Yes. I'm thinking this discussion definitely will continue. Maybe next time we'll have a cocktail in hand and get the conversation going a little bit more, because this is a touchy subject for a lot of people, but yet it is a subject that needs to be spoken about, because that's why we have you. You're walking us through this very hard thing in our life, very hard situation. And Robert, I want to say thank you so much for joining us here at Life, Love, and Lipstick, our podcast.
Yes, Robert Halpern Law Group. We thank you so much. Where are you located, Robert?
Yonge and St. Clair.
Okay, so downtown Toronto for anyone listening. So we really, really appreciate you coming on the show and giving us, again, a whirlwind of insight and information, because everybody has a ton of questions when it comes to law and divorce law.
And sorry, we have to end this with, Robert, you are now a part of our sisterhood here.
Yes, sister.
Hey.
My pleasure to be part of it.
Thank you.
You are a part of us. We will post all your links on how people can get a hold of you. And again, thank you so much for your time. We really do truly value your time in answering our questions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining Life, Love, and Lipstick with Lesley Stewart and myself, Tracy Lynn, and our special guest, Robert Halpern. And we'll have all his social media links that you can follow him. You can contact him directly if you have any legal questions, or if you are going through the big D. It's not as bad as it's made out to be in media, but it's always worth a good phone call to speak to somebody who can definitely guide you through a very hard time. So in the meantime, we will see you guys next week.
Take care.
Life, Love, and Lipstick.